3, 2, 1. Jordan, you're very welcome back to the Informed Decisions podcast. How's life?
Life is good, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about money and purpose and what it's all about.
Deadly, deadly. And indeed, you left quite an impression on me and indeed on our listeners and indeed the readers of the book at the time. Here I am, a plug-a-rama, taking stock. I think I meant to check the date. I was probably 2022? I think that was.
August 2022 is when Taking Stock came out.
There you go. And so now you're going again with the purpose code. You've more thoughts and ideas to share with people, obviously.
Well, when you write a book, you never know what people are going to make of it when you put it out in the world. So it's your baby until you release it. But once you release it, it becomes everyone else's. And one thing I really learned is the premise behind Taking Stock, or one of the main premises, is that we have to take our sense of purpose, identity, and connections and define them a little better first before we then build a financial framework around it. And so I was out there in the world talking about taking stock and giving people this message. And I got a lot of feedback saying, oh, it's great. You want me to work on my purpose and identity, but specifically purpose. I have no idea how to do that.
Yeah.
And that became the nucleus of thinking about this next book, The Purpose Code. How come we all struggle with purpose so much?
It's a really interesting topic. And like what I see it on a daily, weekly basis when I'm working with clients in terms of that are trying to retire or have retired, is prime example. Recent client really has a good handle on the numbers themselves, but is at that point of, okay, I'm going to hand in my notice. I'm going to ultimately hand in my notice to retire. All right. But before I do that, I want somebody to help me figure out the numbers and make sure that my thinking around the numbers are okay, that we're going to be okay. We have enough. And that's fine. And we can do that. But it is certainly that other aspect of purpose and what is my life going to actually revolve around when I do step away. It's never ending kind of exploration in my experience for a lot of people.
The thing about it is the numbers are knowable, right? So a lot of the times people come to people like me or you because they don't understand the numbers. But we know there's a science behind this, right? There's a calculus to figuring out, do you have enough money to retire or not? The problem is what to do once you retire, what living a full life looks like. That's not something we can just take a simple formula, plug you in, and answer that question. And that's why purpose actually causes people anxiety. And so we know through all sorts of studies that purpose is associated with longevity, health, and happiness. They're great scientific studies that show us that. But the problem is trying to figure out what purpose looks like in your life actually causes lots of people anxiety. And that was what I was getting the feedback from Taking Stock is, look, purpose is anxiety causing to me. I've been looking for it forever. I don't know what it is. And a lot of people even say, I don't think purpose exists.
Okay, interesting. I've never heard it put so bluntly as that. Excellent. So if we can rewind a little bit before we jump into the purpose code and that book that's coming out on the 7th of January. Taking stock. Can you remind our listeners if they've heard you before, or indeed if they're listening to you for the first time, Jordan, what was the catalyst for taking stock? What was your journey in a nutshell ultimately?
So I am two things that make no sense together. I am a physician who became financially independent and eventually decided to practice only hospice-oriented medicine that's dealing with people who are terminally ill or dying. And I do that part-time. And that's one part of my life. The other part of my life is I got really interested in financial independence, started writing a financial independence blog, eventually became a podcaster. And so taking stock is where both of those things come together as one. So as a podcaster, I was interviewing financially independent people, entrepreneurs, people who were considering things like retirement, authors, all of these people. And they were really good, again, at telling me how to get where they were or how we can improve our financial lives. But a lot of them were a little bit stumped on the why. Well, once I do this, what happens then? Or what do I do with my life? Or what is the bigger why behind all of this? And strangely enough, I started getting those type of answers from, of all places, my hospice patients. When my hospice patients were contemplating their own deaths and knowing that they had days or weeks left over, they started doing a lot of deeper thinking about who they are, what they wanted to, and what were their goals in their lives, and specifically what was causing them regrets. And so I started taking this knowledge of what you would regret if you found out you were going to be dying soon, and started bringing that to the financial independence community and saying, well, we're not dying anytime soon, but what valuable information it would be for us to have that perspective or that mindset. We spend so much time thinking about money, but money is really a tool. It's not a very good goal. And if you make money your goal, you're going to find things feeling kind of empty when you get to that goal. But if you start thinking about money as a tool to live our best lives and do those things that are meaningful to us, then we get back to those dying patients and start asking, well, how do we know what's important? How do we know what a sense of purpose, identity, and connections in our lives looks at? And I found that the dying, having this knowledge that their life was ending soon, could really give us a perspective that the rest of us could use. And that's how the book Taking Stock came about.
Awesome. And what's, in your opinion, what has been the impact of Taking Stock for people that have picked it up and engaged properly with it?
Well, what I found the problem with the financial independence movement, and we find also with traditional retirement, is that people spend so much time getting to this place that they often don't think about the why behind that or what they're going to do once they're there. So there's a good deal of people who would get, for instance, to financial independence. They would leave a job that they were no longer happy at, and they would find themselves lost and even going through depression and anxiety, pretty much asking themselves, what now? And so the idea behind the book was to take some of the pressure and stakes off of worrying about the money accumulation and start getting people to realize that money is a tool that gets us to certain goals in our lives. And if we can figure out what those goals are, we can actually start living them today, regardless of if we've gotten there or not. Because there are two big problems. One is you don't want to get to retirement or get to financial independence and find yourself lost and depressed because you don't know what to do with yourself. But the other side is also true. You don't want to end up dying young and having put off all those important things in your life because you were waiting for this one day when you had enough money. And so that was always my goal with this book. And so the great part of having the book out there after it's been there for a few years is I get these stories back of people who have become more intentional, people who said, you know what, I can ease on the brakes a little bit, not get to financial independence so fast, and start really concentrating on these things I want for myself now. What do I really want to do with this wonderful thing, this money that I'm accumulating? And so that's how I really feel like it's helped people ease off worrying about the money so much and start thinking about what kind of life they really want to build.
One of the really interesting references or stories in the Taking Stock book, in my opinion, Jordan, was that the three brothers. Can you tell it better than I? Can you tell that story of three brothers and the different methods or ways that people can get to a position of independence ultimately?
So the story of the three brothers is a parable, and it's a parable about the different ways we get to financial independence. But as I tell the story, you realize it's a lot more than just how we get to financial independence. It's about the why of how we do what we do. So in the parable, there's the oldest brother, and all these three brothers are setting off on a path, a journey. And the oldest brother doesn't particularly like the path, so they race through it. They skip sleep and meals, and they try to get finished as fast as possible because they want their freedom. And they can't wait to get there. And indeed, they finish incredibly fast, and they're exhausted, but they have lots of time and space for freedom in their life. The middle brother thinks a lot like the eldest brother, but they don't really have the strength and stamina. So they will rush through things, but then they get halfway or a quarter of the way and they get exhausted and they have to take a break. They take a flight of fancy, what we'd call in today's financial parlance, something like a mini retirement. They take a little time off, they refresh their energy and stamina, and then they set back off on the trail. The last or youngest brother is interesting because as opposed to trying to rush through that trail, they actually like what they're doing. They enjoy every moment of the walking and noticing nature and the river and the trees and the change of seasons. And it takes them longer than the first brother. The eldest brother's the fastest. It takes them longer than the middle brother, who's a little bit slower. And finally, the youngest brother gets to the end of the path and they do something that's incredibly surprising. And it's taken them months and years longer than the other brothers. They turn around and walk back the way they came. And so the idea behind the parable is this is kind of three different ways we can get to financial independence. The first brother is more front loading the sacrifice, grinding it out. If you were into the financial independence, retire early movement, these were the early fire practitioners. They didn't like their jobs. And so instead of living a life of purpose, identity, and connections, they kind of put it off and said, well, I'll get to that when I'm done making money. And so they front load that sacrifice. And hopefully at the age of 40 or 50, they get where they want to be. They stop working and then can really pursue purpose, identity, and connections. The middle brother is more kind of passive income or side hustles. So these are people who want to do some really hard work up front. They want to build up some side hustles or passive income with this idea that after a few years of really hustling, instead of waiting till they're 40 or 50, they can ease off a little bit. And they define financial independence as opposed to some net worth number like the eldest brother. The middle brother is really looking at monthly passive income or side hustles, enough so that they can slow down and start enjoying purpose, identity, connections much quicker than the eldest brother. And finally, the youngest brother is what I call the passion play. They do something that is full of purpose, identity, and connections from day one. So if you do something you're ultra passionate about and you make enough money to survive, to cover your monthly bills, you're kind of financially independent by day one. And so three different paths. The parable really doesn't tell us which is the better path. It really depends who you are. But the key to the parable of the three brothers and the key to the three paths is we really have to take into account purpose, identity, and connections in the beginning, and then build that pathway to financial independence, whichever one we choose around it. But if we're not intentional about purpose, identity, and connections, then we don't know which path to choose. We don't know what our ultimate goal is. And a lot of times we find ourselves lost, maybe racking up lots of money, but even unsure whether we want to retire or not because we're not sure what we're retiring to. So that's the idea behind the three brothers and how the parable works.
And if I'm right in understanding, you've taken the purpose element of purpose, identity, and connection and focused on that in the Purpose Code book. Is that where it's gone?
Yes, very much so. So I talk about in Taking Stock purpose, identity, and connections, and people understand identity a little bit more. This process of asking yourself, I am, and filling in the blank and really getting to who you are as a person. People kind of get that. And connections naturally flow from having a sense of purpose and understanding your identity. But the purpose part actually is what I found people really getting stuck on. Okay. And I heard the same thing over and over again. I don't know how to find my purpose. And that's what really sent me diving into the literature, trying to really understand, well, if purpose is such an important thing, how come it causes so much anxiety? And there have been studies that show that up to 91% of people at some point in their life have what I would call purpose anxiety, real fear, depression, anxiety around this idea that they don't know what their purpose is. So, it's a paradox. How can purpose be so ultra important to our health and well-being and yet cause us so much anxiety and stress? And I knew that was a really good topic for a book.
Interesting. And I'm intrigued as to how you tackle it. You mentioned you dove into the research in terms of creating tools and structures and ultimately homework for people to do to figure it out. How did you go about shaping that, and how do you feel about the product that you've produced?
Well, so when I took all of my experience as a physician for 20 or 30 years, as a hospice doctor, as a financial blogger, a financial podcaster, an author, and then I looked at all the research, it really hit me that we probably look at purpose incorrectly. It's probably not just one phenomena, but at least two. And one of them is probably more associated with disappointment and anxiety. And the other is probably more associated with that health, longevity, and happiness that we're looking for. And so really the structure of the book focuses on this idea, really a few different points. Focuses partially on this idea that we probably look at purpose wrong and that we're focusing on the wrong kind of purpose. And that's why it's causing us so much anxiety. And after we sort through that, this idea that, believe it or not, purpose can lead to all sorts of impact and legacy, but not in the way people generally think. And so that's kind of how the book is structured. But the big point is that we probably get purpose wrong. I kind of break it out into big P purpose and little p purpose. Big P purpose is the kind of purpose everyone thinks they're supposed to have. It's all about impact and goals, and it's audacious and it's easy to fail. And most people never actually live up to that purpose. They never become a billionaire or cure cancer or end up on the space shuttle to the moon. those are these big, audacious goals that actually
Yes.
make us feel more disappointed and anxious, whereas little P purpose is much more process oriented. So this is doing things that we enjoy, that are abundant, that are very hard to fail, and actually fill us up and excite us day to day. And so that's kind of the big difference that I talk about in this book.
Interesting. Yet one of your blogs that I really liked was the pitfalls of pursuing big goals, right? Which I think is to that point, curing cancer or whatever it is. So I would find, or I haven't analyzed it too closely in recent times, but in my head, the way I phrase it is I'm trying to make a positive difference in financial services in Ireland, right? I'm trying, right? So that's not to say I think I can achieve that because I'm trying. Whether I actually do make the difference is another thing entirely. But all I guess is my intent is to do X, right? I think that's a
And a
subtle, a
lot of
subtle thing for me in my own head, maybe.
and a lot of times I say, well, that's a great goal. And it's not that we shouldn't have goals. I always talk about being goal agnostic. This idea that we shouldn't have big goals, but ultimately you want to fill your time with doing things that you really enjoy the process of doing
Mm,
in service of that goal,
mm,
right? So
mm,
if your goal is to bring financial literacy to Ireland, hopefully you're filling your time up with these really exciting things you do, whether that's one-on-one counseling, whether that's doing a podcast. All of those are versions of what I'd call little P purpose. And the way you know the difference is goals are really easy to fail. Like, so you might say, I
mm,
want to have this impact on financial literacy in Ireland, and I'm going to define it by touching 1,000 lives or getting 50 people out of poverty or whatever you do, you define a big goal. It's very, very definable, and you either succeed or fail. It's kind of all or nothing.
mm.
On the other hand, if you say, well, I'm going to be the kind of person who wants to change literacy rates in Ireland and help people. And so I'm going to fill my days with these exciting things that I really love doing that are going to affect that.
Interesting.
That's more the point, not whether you reach that ultimate goal or not, but that you fill your day with these activities and touch other lives because you're doing things that light you up. And you're going to
Mm,
ultimately form a community because you are being your best self doing things you like doing. Now, let's look at the other side of that. Let's say that your goal is to have a certain impact on literacy or financial understanding in Ireland, and you fill your days with doing things that you don't particularly like,
mm,
or that you feel thwarted when you're not successful, or you feel stressed that you're not going to reach the goal. What happens is you end up spending 90-95% of your time being unhappy because you're not getting there. And even if you do ultimately reach the goal, it's only a small period of time where you're at that goal and you're feeling happy till you start putting in new goals. And then if you're doing things daily to reach those goals that you don't enjoy, that aren't filling you up, you're really spending a lot of your time feeling frustrated as opposed to being fulfilled and enjoying what you're doing.
awesome. I love it. And there's a couple of things that are jumping off the page to me there, Jordan. Is one is around and again, this ties in with the subtitle of the book, which is around unlocking meaning, maximizing happiness, and creating a lasting legacy, right? So, can you talk to us about those three subheadings of meaning, happiness, and legacy, and how purpose can, how establishing or working on towards the purpose can help us in those three areas?
So basically, I look at happiness, which I think ultimately is our goal, is really consists of two things, meaning and purpose. And so I think when you get meaning and purpose correct, you end up being happy. So let's talk about meaning. Meaning and purpose are not the same thing. In my brain, meaning is our
Mm,
cognitive beliefs about our past. It's all about our past and it's all about thoughts. And it's the stories we tell ourselves about our past. It's how we think of what we've gone through. Happy people tend to tell themselves heroic stories about their past. They'll say, I had
mm,
these bad things happen to me, but I overcame them. And therefore, they feel optimistic and happy when they head towards the present and future. That's meaning and it has to do with our past. Purpose has to do with our present and future. It doesn't really have to do with our past. It's all about activities. Now, the place where people have trouble is a lot of times when it comes to meaning, they
mm,
feel all sorts of trauma from their past and they don't resolve some of those issues. And so they don't feel like they were enough, maybe bad things happen to them. They feel like they were a victim. They come into the present and future and don't feel enough. And then they try to purpose their way to happiness or purpose their way to enough by creating these big, huge goals. But the problem is, if your issue is in your past and has to do with meaning, it's really hard in your present and future to fix that. You have to really go to your past. So meaning is about your past. It's about telling yourself better stories so that you feel enough. Then you can joyously move into purpose, which is all about action, and it's about your present and future. Here's the thing. When you have a good sense of meaning and you parlay that into activities in the present and future that are purposeful, you generally create legacy and impact. And here's why. I told you the studies about purpose really relate to health, longevity, and happiness. We know that having a sense of purpose causes these things, or at least they're correlated. On the other hand, if you look at some of the best studies about happiness, and I'm pointing to the Harvard Adult Health Study, it took place over 70 years, and they pretty much interviewed people every 2 years. They eventually did EEGs and MRIs. They did all sorts of things. It started with a bunch of Harvard graduates, but then eventually brought in 1,500 of their family members. Then they brought in some controls from the Boston area who were not highly educated like the Harvard people. And after 70 years of continuously following up with these people, they found that what was associated with happiness wasn't purpose, even though I'm talking about how important purpose is. It wasn't money. It wasn't job satisfaction. It wasn't your title. The thing that was most associated with happiness was actually interpersonal connections. And so interpersonal connections, I think, are what make us happy, which you all should be asking me, well, what does that have to do with purpose? In my opinion, when you pursue little p purpose, doing things that light you up, you tend to be your most intentional self, and that attracts people to you. Like a moth to a flame, people see your radiance when you're doing these things you really love doing, and they want to be a part of it. You end up collaborating with them. You end up having mentor-mentee relationships, teacher and student. You tend to build things, and that's where the impact and legacy comes in. And so a lot of people have trouble understanding this concept, and I love to talk about my maternal grandfather, who I never met. My maternal grandfather died in the 1960s, but he loved math, and he was a CPA. And when my mom was little, she would sit on his lap and he would show her all his spreadsheets and explain what he was doing. For my maternal grandfather, little p purpose was math. He just loved doing it, regardless of what came of it. My mom saw him doing this, tried on that identity, as little kids often do, and she found that she loved math. Fast forward years and years later, long after my maternal grandfather died, I had a learning disability and I was having trouble reading, but I very much identified with my mom's love of math because I had seen her practicing that because she had become a CPA too, and I was good at math. So one of the things that got me through that learning disability when I was woefully behind everyone else was that connection to math, that little p purpose that I had pretty much inherited from my maternal grandfather. Years later, I became a physician. I was seeing a patient. I noticed a mathematical connection between two of his labs that no one else had seen, and we diagnosed him with a rare disease that was easily treatable. So he was on death's doorstep, but we were easily able to treat him. He was a pastor at a local church, and he took in runaways and gave them food and shelter and got them connected to social services. So think about this. By practicing little p purpose, this guy who died in the 1960s, who lived in New York, just doing what he loved, the effect of his life is being felt decades and decades and decades later, hundreds of miles away in a suburb of Chicago, where this pastor, because his medical issues were taken care of, is able to help runaway kids, all related to little p purpose. That is impact. That's legacy. That's how we change the world. And we don't do it by becoming billionaires or by becoming president. You can do those things if you want, but ultimately, how purpose and meaning eventually lead to legacy and impact is through what I call generational growth. It's these things we pass on to the people around us when we are pursuing little p purpose and doing things that light us up.
I love it. It's like the ripple effect ultimately there, as you said, intergenerational. And the little p purpose is very interesting. I love old Irish history and how people used to live in Ireland. I always find that fascinating. And for example, Jordan, I came across a recent archive footage of two bachelors living in rural Ireland. These guys are in their 70s. They'd never married. So they're living in this one bed bungalow in rural Ireland, and they're farming,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of small fields. And it chronicles the last few years of their life, basically. And to me, I was like, that's an incredible existence. You can romanticize it and say it was fantastic, but it probably wasn't. It wasn't an easy life, right? And they spoke about that. It wasn't an easy life. And then one of them died, and it became a very lonely place for the other,
Yeah.
right? So, in that type of scenario, do you think, no matter how good or bad life is, that you can identify the purpose piece and the meaning piece, or is it just something that people who are struggling with life pursue? Or is it a help mechanism, or is it something that everybody should do?
I think it's something that everyone should do. I think purpose connects us to our world and our people around us and to our internal joys. And I think it's why we exist here, is to make those connections. And the easiest way to do that is through little p purpose. So certainly someone who's struggling, feeling disconnected, depressed, etc., I think it's a great time to think about purpose. But I also think if you're generally happy and wandering
Mm,
through life and maybe doing a job that's so,
mm,
um, this is a precious short life we have, and we only get so much time, and we don't have any control over that time passing. It passes no matter what we do. The only thing we do have control over is what activities that we do as that time passes. And so, how can we win at the game of life, which, in my opinion, is filling up as much of our time as possible with those really joyful activities? The answer is little p purpose. How do we bring more little p purpose into our life? How do we structure a life around that? And how do we use our various goals to spend more time doing that? So money how do we use our various tools to build a life around that? Money is one of many tools. We tend to focus on money a lot because it is an
mm.
extremely powerful tool in allowing us to use our time towards little p purpose, but it's just one of many. Our communities, our youth, our energy, our passions, our free time, those are also tools that we can use to maximize our time, to be spending as much of it as possible doing joyful things, doing little p purpose like activities.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the little p purpose, and how we can identify maybe what activities we could or should possibly be doing that if we're not already doing them? Because in modern life, an awful lot of us are extremely busy, right? And geez, I haven't got any more spare time to be given to anything else. Never mind, going off finding purpose. Where could or should people start in that journey?
So first and foremost, what you just said at the end there is phooey and not true. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics does the time survey every year and shows that your average American has about 5 hours of free time a day. And in fact, the wealthy tend to have less free time than the people who are less wealthy. So people
Okay.
who are from lower socioeconomic classes have about 6 hours of free time a day, whereas everyone else has somewhere between 5 and 5.5. So
Amazing.
the idea that we don't have time, I think, is overrated.
Mm,
But it is true. A lot of people say, okay, purpose, great. Well, how do I find my purpose? Well, the first thing I say is you generally don't find purpose, you create purpose. So this is a very active process, but you do have to decide what to build purpose around. So you do have to find something I like to call purpose anchors. These are these anchors that you then build activities of little p purpose around. So that's an exceedingly good question. How do you find these little p purpose anchors in your life? And in the book, I actually talk about 4 or 5 different techniques or mechanisms, and there's some exercises in there to do this. But to list some of them off briefly, one of them that I talked about in my first book, Taking Stock, is the life review. So
mm,
life review is a process we do with hospice patients. It's a structured series of questions where we ask them about their lives and get them to think about their successes, their failures, and the important people in their lives, and importantly, their regrets. And we do that to help them deal with their lives. But in a young, healthy person who isn't dying, it can be a great place to find purpose anchors. So a simple life review is one big question: is if I found out I was going to die tomorrow, what would I regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? I love this word regret, because if you are dying, regret is a big disappointment because you don't have time, energy, or agency to fix it. But if you are young and healthy, regret is just another name for a purpose anchor. And so a life review, or at least looking at your regrets, is a great way to start building those purpose anchors. Another really good way is looking at your childhood. I always tell people, what did you love during childhood that you don't do anymore? A lot of times people come back to sports or horse racing or collecting things, all these versions of purpose they had that they've lost as they've gotten older and gotten busy building a life. A really good place to find purpose anchors is the joys of childhood. Another one is work. So we talk about not liking work, and I talk about in both this book and the last book, the art of subtraction. If you were to subtract everything you didn't like about work, what would be left? Me personally, I got tired of being a doctor, but when I subtracted everything out, I realized I still like doing this hospice work. I would do it even if I wasn't being paid for it. So that became a purpose anchor for me. There are a bunch of other ways to find purpose anchors. One of my favorites is called the spaghetti method, which just means you throw a bunch of stuff up against the wall and see what sticks. So if you really are not finding any version of purpose anchors in your life, say yes to a bunch of things you don't normally say yes to, go to a bunch of events you normally don't go to, do some things that make you feel mildly uncomfortable, and see if any of those are interesting to you. And the only real goal there is to do something that feels like a joyful use of your time. And if you find those type of things, then you can build more activities around that, but then at least you have a purpose anchor. So those are some really easy ways to start thinking about purpose anchors, things to build a life of purpose around. But again, you have to build it. It's not just you find it or fall into it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not gonna fall into your lap probably, right?
Yeah, the opening story of my book talks about Julia Childs. And so Julia Childs was in France for the first time, had a meal, and she was like, this is it. Like, she was eating and it was the most wonderful food ever. And she's like, this is it. This is what I want to do with my life. So that was a purpose anchor. But then what did Julia Childs do? She went to cooking school and failed her first test. She ended up writing a book that took her 10 years to write. I mean, she had to really build a life of purpose around this to become the successfully happy person she eventually was. But again, she had an anchor. She found her anchor, but then she had to build a life of purpose around it.
Awesome. In terms of the type of person or the type of scenario that you were picturing when you were writing this, was there a particular person or stage of life or scenario, Jordan, that you were really directing this towards, or is it something hopefully for everyone?
So when I first thought about this, the people I was most interacting were with people at financial conferences. So these were people who were getting their finances in order to the point where they were starting to feel comfortable with their finances. So they were no longer stuck on the question, will I have enough or not? Maybe they weren't financially independent yet, but they were at this point, they're like, I can see in the future, if I keep doing what I'm doing, I'm going to get there. And they felt really excited about that, but then they also felt a lack of what comes next. So now that this one thing that I spent all my time worrying about, I have under control, what do I do with myself? What if I do decide to leave a job? How am I going to feel fulfilled? How come this thing I thought that was going to make me so happy isn't changing the fact that I still am a person? I have likes and dislikes. I have goals and aspirations. Why isn't this fixing all my problems? So that started with that group. But as I talked to more and more people around it, I found that people long retired were still searching for a better sense of purpose. And I especially found that young people who are leaving college or leaving high school and finding jobs and feeling a little bit trapped were kind of asking, what's the sense of all this? I'm making just enough money to survive. I'm just putting enough food on the table. I'm okay. I'm eking out an existence, but there's got to be something more. And so the idea was to start giving people these tools to help them find purpose, whether they are young and have no money, whether they're middle-aged and transitioning, or whether they're older and retired and yet want to start a new phase in life or start feeling like their time is being better utilized.
Love it. And is there, speaking of the younger people there, is there an age at which somebody should really be in order to start thinking about this, Jordan? Do you need to have a certain element of life experience before you can have the context?
So it's interesting, really young kids. So I'm talking about, kids in play school age, et cetera. They have no problem with purpose. If you've noticed, they'll go out and play in the backyard forever, and they want to build things and draw things and play with things. So young people are great. What happens is, as you get to high school and college, you start rewriting your life and getting rid of all those joyful things and start saying, okay, well, this is how I'm going to make a living and this is who I'm going to become. And all of society's expectations and your parents' expectations, and even the expectations of marketing and social influencers telling you who you're supposed to be as an adult, sometimes get in the way of you actually thinking about what you really want, and you start just doing what you're supposed to do. So what I think is a really good age is high school and college, and especially early professionals. So I'm really talking about the young people. It's a good time to remind them that building a life, a career, and finances are supposed to be in service to that purpose, identity, and connections to that happiness. They are not the end goal unto themselves. They are tools. And so I really like to remind young people, hey, take a breath, think about who you want to be, and then let's start looking at your finances, your job, and all those things and see how it gets you closer to becoming the person you truly want to be. And here's the great news. When you're 20, that is going to look different than when you're 25 or 30. And that's fine. You start at 20, you build your financial life around those things you think are going to be important for you. And as you get older and evolve, that changes. And then you pivot and you change. That might mean a change of job. It might mean a change of career. It might mean working really hard so that you can retire early and do that thing you really love. Or it might be backing off and pushing your retirement dreams to your 60 or 70, but then having plenty of time to do the things you love during your daily schedule, especially if that's not something at work. It can look different for all of us, but it starts with the intentions. And that's why I think it's a really good place for young people to start. When you're starting to think about how am I going to build my life, it's a great time to start thinking about why am I building this life and not just the how.
Brilliant. Loads of great nuggets and ideas, and I think the book is going to be very useful. I'm looking forward to getting a copy of it myself, Jordan, and we might see if we can get you back maybe in Q1 at some stage to have a deep dive and maybe do a live webinar around it. It'd be really interesting once we get our hands on the copy.
I would love to.
In the meantime, people can pick up the book whether it's the Purpose Code or Taking Stock. Where's the best place for people to find out more about you and pick up copies?
So both of the books are available where all good books are sold, and specifically online is really easy with Amazon. If you want to know more information about me or find links to order the book, go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com.
Jordan, top class. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with our dear listeners today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.